My brothers seemed normal growing up, but then they shot our parents. It was late one summer night, and the house was quiet, except for the faint hum of the air conditioner in our small suburban home. My parents, Mark and Karen, had been out for dinner, just like they did every Friday. They didn't come home early anymore, not since Caleb and Joshua were old enough to look after me. At 15, I was the youngest, and though I used to miss having them around more, I'd gotten used to their absences. That night, I was in my room, scrolling through my phone, when I heard the front door open. Footsteps. Heavy, slow, but then silence. I thought nothing of it at first. My brothers were probably downstairs, watching TV, but something about the quiet after the footsteps, it felt wrong. My heart began to race for reasons I couldn't explain, so I just lay there, frozen. Then, out of nowhere, I heard it, a crash, something heavy hitting the floor. But before I could even react, another crash followed. I leaped from my bed, my heart pounding in my chest. Running down the stairs, I called for Caleb and Joshua. No answer. Just the sound of my own breath, shaky and fast. I didn't know then, but that was the moment everything changed. That was the moment my family's darkest secret began to unravel. Caleb was 20 and Joshua was 18. Everyone saw them as the perfect sons. They were popular in school, good at sports, and seemed to have it all. They were my heroes. Strong, protective, and kind. We had a comfortable life. My dad ran a successful business, and mom was a teacher. From the outside, we were the perfect family. But like all families, we had our secrets. I found Caleb standing in the living room, staring down at something on the floor. His face was pale, his fists clenched. Joshua stood beside him, his eyes wide and wild. So I looked closer, and then I saw it. My parents, lying there, motionless. I gasped, backing up in shock. "What happened?" I cried. "What's going on?" Caleb turned to me, his voice low and shaking. "Emma, we came home and found them like this." His eyes flicked over to Joshua, who was still staring at our parents' bodies, like he couldn't believe what he was seeing. I couldn't process what he was saying. Found them? Found them how? My mind raced, trying to piece together what could have happened. A robbery? An accident? But nothing made sense, so Caleb grabbed my arm. "We need to call the police," he said, his voice firmer now, more urgent. I nodded, tears blurring my vision, but before I could reach for the phone, Joshua snapped out of his daze. "No! We can't call them!" His voice was panicked, desperate. Caleb shot him a warning glance, and for a moment, they stood there, exchanging a look I didn't understand. I knew my brothers better than anyone, but in that moment, they felt like strangers. The police arrived quickly, so everything after that felt like a blur. Questions, flashing lights, officers moving around the house, taking notes, speaking in hushed tones. I remember Caleb and Joshua standing close together, whispering to each other. Something felt off. They weren't acting like themselves, but I was too overwhelmed with grief and shock to focus on it. The police asked us where we were that night. Caleb told them we'd all been at the movies and came home to find our parents like this. Joshua backed him up, so I didn't say anything, just nodded in agreement, because I couldn't remember where they'd been, and I trusted my brothers. I thought they were telling the truth. Days passed, and it felt like our world was crumbling. The police had no suspects. They called it a home invasion gone wrong, but no one really knew what had happened. Friends and family came by to offer condolences, but nothing felt real. Every time I looked at Caleb and Joshua, I saw that same strange look in their eyes, the one they'd had the night we found our parents. I tried to ask them about it once. I asked Caleb if something had happened before we got home, something they weren't telling me. He just shook his head, avoiding my gaze, and said, "No, Emma, everything's fine. We're just dealing with it, okay?" But everything was not fine, not by a long shot. Weeks passed, and things grew more and more tense between my brothers. They stopped talking to each other, spending more time apart. So I started hearing arguments through the walls at night, muffled voices, angry words. But one night, I overheard something that made my blood run cold. I was passing by Caleb's room when I heard him say, "You need to shut up about it, Joshua. No one can ever know what really happened." Joshua's voice came next, shaky and scared. "I can't, Caleb. I can't keep this inside. It's eating me alive." I pressed my ear against the door, my heart pounding in my chest. What were they talking about? What was Caleb so afraid of? "I did it for us," Caleb snapped. "For you. For me. For Emma. They were never going to let us live our lives, Joshua. You know that." For a moment, there was silence. So Joshua whispered, "But killing them, it wasn't supposed to happen like that." My breath caught in my throat. I stumbled back, my head spinning. Did I hear that right? Did Caleb just admit to killing our parents? My mind raced. No, it couldn't be true. It had to be some kind of misunderstanding. My brothers couldn't have done this. But deep down, I knew. I'd seen the looks they'd exchanged, the lies they'd told the police. So now I was beginning to understand why. day. The days that followed were the hardest of my life. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't confront them. I was too scared of what I might find out. Instead, I began piecing things together. Little by little, I realized how much I had missed growing up in our house. You see, our parents weren't the perfect people they pretended to be. My dad, Mark, had always been a strict man. But what I didn't know, what I couldn't have known, was how far that went. He controlled every part of our lives, especially Caleb and Joshua. He pushed them to be perfect, to succeed at any cost. I remember how often Caleb would come home late from extra practice, or how Joshua always seemed tense around our dad. So I started thinking back, but I never understood the full picture. Then, one afternoon, I found a letter hidden in Caleb's room while looking for answers. It was from our mother, written years ago but never sent. In it, she talked about how my father had hurt her, emotionally and physically, and how she felt trapped in her marriage. She said she was staying for us, for the family, but that sometimes she wished she had the strength to leave. Tears blurred my eyes as I read it. My mother had been suffering too. It was as if all the pieces were slowly coming together, but I still didn't know the full truth. I couldn't take it anymore. So one night, I confronted Caleb. I told him I knew about the arguments, about the pressure Dad had put on them, and about the letter. His face went pale, and for a moment, I thought he was going to deny everything. But then, he broke down. "Emma," he whispered, his voice cracking. "You don't understand. He was destroying us. He was destroying me. I couldn't let it go on." He told me everything. How Dad had pushed him and Joshua to their limits, controlling their every move. How he had become violent, hitting them when they didn't live up to his impossible standards. So worst of all, he revealed that Dad had been abusing Joshua for years, emotionally, physically, and in ways that made my stomach turn. It was a nightmare neither of them could escape. But one night, after a particularly brutal confrontation with our father, Caleb snapped. He couldn't take it anymore. So he grabbed Joshua, and together, they made a plan. They never meant for it to go so far, Caleb swore to me. It was supposed to be a confrontation, a way to stand up to him. But when our father fought back, everything spiraled out of control. In a moment of rage and fear, they killed him. Then, in the chaos, our mother had walked in. She wasn't supposed to be there, but when she saw what happened, Caleb said they had no choice. Tears streamed down my face as he told me the truth. The weight of it was unbearable. How could this be my family? How could my brothers, the people I loved most, do something so terrible? I didn't know what to do with the truth. I couldn't bring myself to turn them in, but I also couldn't live with the lies anymore. I was trapped. Just like they had been, trapped in the web of secrets and pain that had consumed our family for years. So in the end, it was Joshua who made the decision for me. A few days after Caleb's confession, he came to me, his face pale and his eyes hollow. "I can't live like this anymore, Emma," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I need to tell the truth." But my heart broke. With trembling hands, I made the hardest call of my life. I dialed the police and told them everything. I didn't know what would happen next, but I knew that the truth had to come out. The trial was long and painful. Caleb and Joshua were charged with the murder of our parents, and the media had a field day with the story. The perfect suburban family turned nightmare. But as the trial went on, something strange happened. People began to see my brothers not just as killers, but as victims too. Victims of a broken home, of a father who had driven them to the edge. In the end, Caleb and Joshua were sentenced to prison, but not for life. The judge acknowledged the abuse they had suffered and took it into consideration. So it wasn't the ending I had hoped for, but it was the best we could get. Now, years later, I still think about that night all the time. I think about the secrets my family kept, the lies we lived, and the terrible price we paid for it. I visit my brothers in prison, and though we don't talk much about what happened, we found a way to move forward. But the scars are still there, and they always will be.